I think the African-American vote's going to play a pivotal role. Unfortunately, for Sanders' side, it's a closed primary. New York has some really arcane, strict rules. I'm interviewing people who weren't aware that you had to change registration or party affiliation 6 months before a primary. You know, with the African-American vote, I've been very, you know, careful not to give my views as if to tell African-Americans, well, you should like Bernie. But the more African-Americans I speak to, specifically in South Carolina, a lot of them I speak to, you know, like Bernie, but they're more familiar with the Clintons. And there's a distrust of politicians like Bernie who speak in very exuberant, idealistic ways, because as a race and a people, they've been sold the bill of goods for so long, and really it's not been executed on by D.C. What do you think in terms of the African-American vote in New York? And more importantly, what exactly are the policies of Hillary Clinton versus Senator Sanders? Which do you think would help the community more?
Man, there's so much there, and
I should say you were, you know, before the Daily News, very heavily involved in the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of different things.
So, man, okay, there are two pieces that I wish everybody would read. One was this piece that Michelle Alexander, who's author of New Jim Crow, wrote for The Nation about. Was kind of a deep dive on particularly Hillary Clinton, but the Democratic Party in general, and why African Americans should be deeply skeptical of Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party. And she wrote that months ago, and it actually had a huge impact on me because I revere Michelle Alexander. The New Jim Crow had an enormous. I mean, if I had to tell you one book that impacted me the most over the past 5 or 6 years, it's probably that book. I respect her tremendously, and she explained in great detail why African Americans, why black voters should be skeptical of Hillary, skeptical of Bill, and not just skeptical of Hillary because of Bill, but also because of her own stances and policies. But she even then dug deeper and said of the Democratic Party in general, and people skipped over what she said there, and I haven't been able to shake it. The last third of her piece was about how she felt we were into a time where we probably needed to start something on our own. People of color, progressives in general, but people of color in particular, should consider starting an independent political party and movement apart from the Democratic Party, particularly if the Democratic Party did not truly prove itself to care deeply about our needs and issues. I agree with that. And I've actually, it's a revolutionary idea that it makes them nervous. It thinks, like, how could you start an independent party, or how could you support an independent candidate? It would guarantee that a Republican would win. That's kind of the path that people go down. But Eddie Glaude, who's a professor at Princeton, was also kind of a hero of mine when I was a student at Morehouse. He's a Morehouse College graduate. Eddie Glaude has a piece that just came out for Time magazine about what he calls the two faces of Bill Clinton and the two faces of the Democratic Party. And he said how the Democratic Party, it used to be really, really skilled at showing you one face but hiding the other. And he said he felt like Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party has lost that. It has either lost the skill of hiding their other face, or that voters in general are more skilled at just detecting both of them. Some of it is social media. Some of it is the rise of independent media. We're able to see it and replay stuff and loop it and be like, whoa, 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 this isn't right. And those two pieces are really important. And Eddie Glaude's piece, Michelle Alexander's piece. I hate New York's primary voting rules. They're terrible. It's people, like, even to the point that Donald Trump's own children missed the deadline to register to vote for their father. Like, I tweeted that and shared it as a joke, but I think it's actually indicative of the reality that a lot of people in this process, including children of candidates, are not clear on where to register, when to register, who has to register, by what date, for what party. It's in New York. It's not a matter of, oh, we vote on April 19th. I'm there. Like, that's just not how it works. You have to have done A by a certain date, B by a certain date, C by a certain date. And it's just not widely known. And so what's going to happen is, come April 19th, I think there are going to be tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who would like to vote, who just are not properly registered. They missed deadlines that they didn't know existed. And that's unfortunate. And Bernie won Wisconsin in part because in Wisconsin, you can register to vote up until that very day. And
I was online at I was covering Marquette University.
I saw you.
There was 2.5-hour lines. Not so great, but it was all same-day registration of students.
Apparently, the line goes pretty much till the end of the world.
So Bernie, a few months ago, was down 20 points in Wisconsin, and he ended up winning by 14 points. And he won by 14 points, one, because he spent a ton of time there, and voters understood him, knew him, but also because people who wanted to vote could register up until that day. And I think it made a significant difference. And New York generally is progressive on many issues. The state leans Democratic in a major way. And even most of the Republicans in New York would probably be seen as Democrats in the South. And so the state leans Democratic. But these election rules and laws are very restrictive. And I say that obviously because I think they're particularly restrictive of Bernie, but they need to be changed after this campaign, no matter what. And that probably won't have any effect on Bernie Sanders. And it's one of those things that I just didn't know it was this way until the election started. So yes, those rules have to be addressed. I think there's a ton of room for reform there, and just some simple reforms with the New York election laws. But with black voters in New York and beyond, it's been a learning experience for me, because this is the first time in my life where I've seen black voters very split on a Democratic candidate. Now, I want to say I think that's a good thing. So I'm 36, and so I've been able to vote in 3 or 4 presidential elections. I think 4. And for most of my life, African Americans, by and large, have gotten completely behind one particular candidate, and obviously with some exceptions, but have gotten behind one candidate. And the problem with that is it doesn't give you an opportunity to really have power or influence or bargaining power, if you will, with other candidates. And so while African Americans are still almost exclusively a part of one party, the Democratic Party, which I still think, I'm not saying African Americans should join the Republican Party, but I think it's a huge limiting force when you're narrowed into one party. Whoever gets this nomination knows, by and large, that they're going to have the African American vote. Maybe less so than in previous elections, but they know. Well, you know, Michelle Alexander or Cornel West or Ta-Nehisi Coates or Harry Belafonte have all endorsed Bernie Sanders. And that's new. For there to be a clear establishment candidate, which Hillary Clinton is the most established candidate the Democratic Party could ever have, to have scores of not just prominent African Americans, but then young African American voters. Young people across virtually every demographic have chosen Bernie Sanders. Young and poor, young and black, young and Latino, young and Asian, young and white, young and a woman, have almost exclusively gone towards Bernie. And so what we have here is a real divide where young people across all demographics, including African Americans and others independents, have chosen one Democratic candidate, and then you get established voters who have a deep history of voting, who have a relationship with the party.
Older folks.
Yeah, older voters and some younger voters who, for various reasons, also have a relationship with the party. They've been into Democratic politics as a hobby or as a profession. And so they break toward Hillary. I think people have reduced black voters in a way that's offensive to say, hey, black voters just go with who's familiar. And a lot of voters stick with who is familiar. That may be true for some people. But I think, although I strongly disagree with the reality and truth of it, a lot of black voters trust Hillary Clinton. They do trust her in part because they know her, but they have looked at her and they just see something different than you see or I see. And, that's true for millions of voters. Mm-hmm. Like, we would be making a mistake if we thought the millions and millions of people who voted for Hillary Clinton just have no idea what the hell they're doing. Mm-hmm. Like, African Americans, and we're speaking in kind of vague generalities here, you have a strand of African Americans in this country who talk about revolutionary change and get excited and love it and want it. But by and large, the norm in African American communities, that talk of revolution makes folk nervous.
Right.
Like, I believe most African Americans, most older people in general, but even older African Americans, are perfectly fine with incremental change.
It's about negotiations, and it's about incremental increases.
And particularly as long as they feel core rights are being protected. Mm-hmm. And a lot of folk, particularly older African American voters, this talk of radical change, radical shifts, it's just not, it makes folk nervous.
Yeah, that's a little interesting to me because, obviously as a white person and someone who hasn't experienced, the racism and injustice firsthand, I look at, studying Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, and a lot of these older generation people who are more pragmatic came up in that generation. That wasn't a radical movement. That was a justice movement. But it definitely was idealistic. It definitely was about dreaming big. So I think there might be, to me, there seems to be a disconnect there.
Well, let me push on that a little bit. I think that's probably, it's a great observation, but we'd have to go back and see that Dr. King was not nearly as popular as we want him to be today. Like, right. I've been speaking all around the country at colleges and universities all over the place. And I kind of tell the joke like this. Jesus's last name was not Christ. OK, like he was not Mr. Christ. OK, like we look back on this historical figure named Jesus and give him a certain esteem that historically he actually didn't have. He was actually very hated by the political elite. He was executed by the government, and most people abandoned him when it mattered most, including his own friends and family and crew. And his name was not Christ. We look back on this, he was not Mr. Christ, and his mother was not Mary Christ. Like that's not the reality of it. But we look back on it and we judge it differently. The same thing is done with a lot of figures throughout history. The Dr. King that we know today, that we see on commercials, that we celebrate on his birthday or through Black History Month, that was not the reality of what he lived. Like, when they marched in certain cities, there were times where they struggled to get anybody to come out.
Right.
Like, revolution has always scared the majority of people. Like, we can't judge Dr. King on how many people came out to hear the I Have a Dream speech. Like, that was a highlight for sure. But when they, for instance, Chicago gave Dr. King hell. And even New York, while he loved New York City, actually, and thought of it as like a second home, they struggled to find ways to get the civil rights movement roaring in New York. And so we look back on King and say, man, if you admire Dr. King, how could you not be for the revolution? Logically, that makes sense. But, you know, any revolution that we look at, if we went back and looked at Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey, who were revolutionaries in the time of slavery, if we went back and looked at Marcus Garvey or Malcolm X was more loved the day after he died than any point ever in his life. And he was loved more when he was missed than he was when he was actually speaking hardcore revolutionary truths on the block in Harlem. And so now we look back and say, hey, how can you love Malcolm X and not be for a revolutionary movement? I have found, and this is painful, man, I found it myself in the hardest ways, that people love talking about revolution way more than they love participating in one. Right. And I have had, on 2 or 3 different occasions in my life, I don't know if you've seen Braveheart, where William Wallace, you know, he leads this revolution and he thinks this particular man is going to be there to support him, only to find out that the man has joined the establishment and betrayed him. Man, Jordan, I have had that happen to me on multiple occasions. And I have found, and I see it now with sympathy, it's hard to be a revolutionary. So I think you find a lot of voters of color are fully participating in mainstream America. And even though they experience discrimination and hatred and bias and all of that, the notion of blowing it all up and starting over again, that's not widely accepted. It's complicated, man. And I think what I see is the more all voters, including African-American voters, actually see Bernie, particularly if they get to hear him face-to-face, go to an event or a rally, or actually engage an honest, sincere supporter of his, they're deeply influenced by it. It's what happened in Michigan. That's why Bernie won Michigan. It's why Bernie won Washington State. It's why he won every single county in Washington State. And it's why he won Wisconsin. And people dismiss those states, which I'm offended by myself, as if they're not diverse. But many of those states are more diverse than many of the states that Hillary won, and including Tennessee and Ohio and others. And so when you're winning Washington State and Hawaii and Wisconsin and Michigan, of course those states are diverse. And
let's not forget, I mean, he's getting a lot of support as a Jewish man from the Muslim community.
Absolutely, which is a huge issue. There are so many stories about Bernie that should be the feel-good story of the year. That a man who not only is Jewish, but has a who lived in Israel, who has a deep history there and a deep knowledge there, but has won over on principle, has won over the majority of Muslim voters who look at him and say, I trust this guy. I mean, that's a powerful story that, in part because Donald Trump has sucked the air out of the room, in part because Hillary this is like a coronation for Hillary Clinton. The fact that Bernie is getting 80 to 90% of young voters is a crazy story. That a 74-year-old, disheveled, Jewish socialist, has, on principle, won over the hearts of young people is a huge story. And people are offensive in the way they tell it. And I speak on college campuses everywhere I go, and they say, oh, it's because they think they're going to get free stuff. That's BS. They trust Bernie. They don't think, they're smart enough to know that whatever Bernie does, they may never see it or benefit from it themselves. If you're in college, you don't think you're going to get free tuition next year. That's not your belief. They listen to Bernie and they trust him.
Yeah, it's not just about the policy, it's about the person.
It is. And so, like, young people are great judges of character. Muslims in America have to have enormous senses for who is speaking truth to them and who is selling them a bill of goods. Because Muslims in America right now are being discriminated against and thrown under the bus in some of the most horrendous ways imaginable. So when they listen to the candidates, they're listening for sincerity, honesty, integrity.
Hearing the rhetoric that's going on in the media makes me sick. Because I, as an individual, I'm constantly trying to raise awareness and make sure that everyone is treated equally in this country. So, to the next president of the United States, what do you think about that?
Muslim voters right now have so much on the line that when I see my Muslim friends and colleagues support Bernie, it inspires me, man, because it's what's beautiful about Bernie is that he, and not in a political way, he has downplayed his being Jewish in a way that has caused people to even forget that he is Jewish, that a Jewish candidate has never even won a primary before. And like, that should have been a huge story, but he's won 15.
Right.
And, but he is who he is, and he never uses his age, he never uses his background as a political tool, you know, and, young people and other voters, they trust him a lot.